You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with your host, Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. It's me, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Intrepid radio program, here on the Odyssey radio network. And Odyssey, you can hear the audio of this that broadcasts out in a national syndication. And that is at odyssey1.com, ODYSY 1.com. And you can also view the simulcast of this, see the video, where you can see my beautiful face, where, unlike Rocky Stucci, I have not shaved my facial hair off. And that is over on my YouTube channel. Just look up Mr. Scotty Roberts, Mr. all spelled out. And go ahead and go subscribe over there and join, and you can watch these every night of the week. So thank you for being here, by the way. I want to hit a topic that we've kind of walked around a couple of times while here on different broadcasts. And that is a topic that can be very taboo on its surface, especially if you are a Christian, if you are a faithful believer in Christianity, if you're Jewish, you go to synagogue, you go to church, you go to all this stuff, these are going to be things that can be very controversial to you. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them, because the controversy is real, and that is this whole topic of Lucifer and Satan and Jesus. I'll just throw the devil in there for good measure. The come up, and it comes up, I see it a lot in like the works of Gardner, when he talks about Jesus and Lucifer being either brother gods or one and the same person, because of some of the titles that are given to Jesus and some of the titles that are given to Lucifer in the Old Testament. And by the way, Lucifer, the word, the name, only appears one time in the entire Bible, and that is in the book of Isaiah. And we're going to explain that a little bit too, what that word means, where it came from. That's not even the original word that was there. But of course, the meaning was meant to be there. But there's another meaning to the passage itself. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. We may or may not get through this all in one sitting. It might be easy to give a bullet point and say, for this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason, it either is or is not identical in meaning. The names or the personages of Lucifer, Satan, and Jesus. And so let's look at this a little deeper. And are Lucifer and Satan even the same personage? Where Isaiah talks about Lucifer, is he even talking about Satan? So let's look at this a little bit. And the whole thing about Satan, by the way, totally other topic, trying to define who he was. I will tell you this. The Jews did not have a Satan the way we understand him. Satan, you will find him in the book of Job, the earliest written book in the Bible, chronologically speaking. This is pre-Jewish religion being codified by Moses much later. You will find an article in front of the word Satan. In the text, an article is a word like the, that, so on and so forth. The appears before the word Satan. The Satan came into the courts of heaven and accused Job. So what does that mean, the Satan? Do I talk about my wife, the Rainy? Well, yeah, I do. I call her the Rainy sometimes, but I'm meaning that in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way. That's the Rainy, the title. But it would be like saying the president, the judge, the governor, things like that, the boss. So the Satan had a definition for the word, and it generally meant the deceiver or the one who comes in and accuses, the accuser. So in the book of Job, the accuser came before God, the Satan. So, but they didn't have a... Satan was equal to what we define as the devil. On Halloween, you see people in the red suits with the horns and the long spiky tail and things like that. There is no, just to put that to rest, there is no biblical definition of Satan or the devil having red skin, pointed ears, a Fu Manchu mustache, horns, and a pointy tail. Nor does it say he carries a pitchfork. Those are all medieval attributes that were given to Satan. I think even in Dante's Inferno, some of the illustrations that went along with that showed that kind of a figure. That's not a biblical concept. So tonight, folks, this is going to be a bit of a Bible study. Don't let that scare you off if you're not a Christian and you're not a Jew and you don't want to look at the Bible. This is for the sake of trying to understand terms that we have used in our society. We hear, the devil made me do it. Phrases like that. Or if you remember the movie The Usual Suspects, that came out well over 20 years ago now. But there was a phrase in there, the devil's greatest lie is convincing people that he doesn't exist. I thought that was pretty profound at the time. But now let's look at these because it's in our common vernacular. Even when we talk about spiritual things, sometimes we have gone so far from Judeo-Christianity and traditional religions in the West that we eschew the whole notion that there could be a Satan or a hell or a devil or Lucifer, we've called him when we want to get high and mighty about his name, which isn't really his name. So there's some interesting stuff to look at in this, and there's interesting ways we can approach it because, and what I was trying to say by that, by the way, was that even when we've drifted a far length away from that kind of teaching or that theology, we sometimes think we're really cool because we can say, he just never exists. There is no devil. There is no Satan. Well, what if he does exist? But what if he exists in a way that is the understanding of him is in a completely different context than you may have understood within Judeo-Christianity or within the mindset, whatever it may be for you right now. Now, those of you who are live in the chat room over on my YouTube channel and watching this, throw up some ideas. If you've got your ideas, I'd like to see them. We can discuss those as well. But throw up your ideas, throw up your source points. Something I don't like, and I'll say this to everybody out there, I love your ideas. I have an open forum. You can share your ideas. But at the same time, I don't like ideas that are just, well, I think this, and I believe this, or I just state something and give nothing to back it up. So if you come in with an idea, well, Satan is really the blah, blah, blah of the blah, 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 and actually, this is what... Well, okay, but tell us why. Give us a source point for that. Don't just tell me what you've heard or what you think, although you can share that stuff. But if you want to be definitive in what you're saying, give a definitive source point, a definitive definition, so we can understand your context, where you're coming from, where you're drawing your information from. So let's look at this right now. I'm going to go over, I took a lot of notes. I got a lot of notes. I got a lot of things I've written. I've got articles other people have written. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Michael Heiser. I have quoted him in some of my books. He wrote a paper on this, and I'm going to make some reference to things that he's written. And he uses a lot of Hebrew in his paper, and I could flash that up on the screen for you and show you when he goes in and he tries to describe some of the Elohim, which I'm going to talk about, because this is what I think that Lucifer, or the chief Satan, may have been, is one of the Elohim. But let's define what the Elohim are. I know there are some trains of thought out there that think the Elohim are just people. But when you go back to the Hebrew, there's something I have always said, and I learned this a long time ago. when you try to exegete ancient text, doesn't have to be just biblical text. I'm talking any text out of ancient culture to try to understand something and understand what was being said and what's going on. There's several things you have to consider. Number one, what does it say in its originally written language as opposed to an English translation or a translation in a modern language? So you've got to understand what the language says and the definitions by that language. Two, you have to understand to whom was that context being written. Who was the audience supposed to be? Was it modern 21st century human beings? Or was it, humans that lived 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago? A third thing is you have to understand what, in context, that text would have meant to those people in their understanding of the universe, of the world, of the way things were done, of their religious, I'm trying to think of the word, their religious beliefs and their system of theology when it comes to biblical topics. So you've got to keep those three things in mind. The language and what it meant in its original language, not English, because you'll have a word like Elohim, which translates in English to God, and gods, because it can be used both singularly and plurally. So Elohim means God in English, but we have an understanding of God that was different than what the people who used the word Elohim in ancient times, thousands of years ago, would have understood. What did Elohim mean? It was a plural word. And we'll get into that a little bit. So understanding the word, how it's defined in its original language, and two, what people would have understood, why the writer was writing this to the people of his day, and three, what those people reading his words in context would have understood as a worldview in context to what was being presented. So keep those things in mind. And I'm going to start going over to some of my copious notes here because I've got a lot of them. And I want to start with this whole idea of, is Lucifer Satan? Or even just a step back from that, who is Lucifer? Where do we find him being mentioned in the Scripture? And what is the comparison that some trains of thought make between Lucifer and Jesus of the New Testament? And by the way, Jesus, we hear Jesus is a false title. I hear Jeff talk about that, Jeff Dougherty over on the Christian Whistleblower, who many of you listen to as well. Jeff Dougherty will talk about plastic Jesus, the false Jesus, and so on. And Jesus, the name didn't even exist in first century Judea. Well, that's very true, except the only way, and I think Jeff and others probably delineate this as well, Jesus is just a Latinized, a Greek Latinized version of the word. Greek and Latin are two different things. Iesu, it's Latin. There was no J in the Hebrew language. Or as it was written in the Greek, is where we see Jesus written, Jesus. That was the Greek in the New Testament. And so Jesus is just a different linguistic version of Jesu, which was a version of Joshua. So in a sense, what you've got when you see Jesus, he's called Yeshua in the Hebrew. Yeshua. That's Joshua in the Hebrew. So just like Joshua, you remember Joshua who led the armies of Moses after the Exodus and then kind of took over as the leader. Joshua, we see that name a lot in the Old Testament. Joshua was simply a Hebrew name back in first century. Joshua converts to or translates to Jesus in modern Latin language. So Iesu. So let's get that out of the way. So Jesus, Joshua. He was considered to be the son of Joseph by legal standards. Religiously or theologically, we call him Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. in Christianity. Well, that wasn't his name. He didn't go fill out any legal documents of his day and say Jesus Christ. He didn't write that down. Christ is just the Greek version of the word Messiah, the Christos. And so that one's Latin. I get my which language I'm referring to in those. Christ is the modern translation, or the translation in the New Testament of Messiah. So Jesus the Messiah, the chosen one, and so on. So let's move away from that. I'm going to get myself buried in trying to explain something. So Jesus, if he was the son of Joseph legally, probably had a name like Yeshua bar Yashaf. Jesus, or Joshua, the son of Joseph. Yeshua bar Yashaf. And even in some fictional writing that I've done, I've referred to Jesus in that sense. Back, in the early 90s, some partners and we did a set of trading cards. Like, think of Batman cards, Superman cards, baseball cards. Trading cards were really big back then, and we wanted to do a set that appealed to kids going to church and their parents, and we called them, what did we call them? Ancient Heroes. And we devised this set of cards that dealt with ancient heroes out of the Bible, and I subsequently did a second set on the life of Jesus, where I did all the illustrations, did a lot of the writing. The Jesus set, I did all the writing, and I referred to him there as Yeshua bar Yashaf. So Joshua, the son of Joseph, is the same person as Jesus. We can go with that. So going back to this Lucifer thing, before we start making that comparison, we have to figure out what Lucifer means, just like Jesus. Jesus means Joshua, or Yeshua, if you want to be all high and mighty and pronounce it in the Hebrew tongue. So Joshua. So Lucifer means light bringer. That is the definition of Lucifer. Now, if Lucifer is to be defined as what we hold to be Satan, the devil, the greatest evil in the universe, the evil on the earth, the greatest evil that exists in Christianity, why does his name mean light bringer? He's the light bringer. So that's what the name means. But it's the same name as the morning star. We have said that Lucifer was the star of the morning, the protector of the glory of God. That this is who he was, and yet he fell, is what they say, and he became Satan. But Lucifer means morning star. It only appears once in the Bible. Look at Isaiah 14:12. It says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" But did the word Lucifer always exist? No. The Hebrew language, in the Hebrew, the word Lucifer is derived from the ancient Hebrew word Hellel. H-E-L-E-L. And if I am not mistaken, don't quote me on this yet, I've got to double check it, it just popped into my mind. Remember when I talked about how Muhammad had created Islam out of whole cloth? I believe that chief god's name Hellel, and he renamed him Allah. I have to double check that. I could look for it right now, but I don't want to take time to do that. I will correct myself if I'm wrong on that. But Hellel is the word Lucifer. It's derived from that word. And the term Lucifer didn't even exist in biblical times when these things were being written. Put thought to it. Lucifer is a Latin word. Lux, meaning light, or look, meaning light. Fire, fier, to bear or to bring. Lucifer. And I just pronounce it French. You know what, that just reminded me of the old Johnny Quest cartoon. The Loup-garou. It was the werewolf, but that's neither here nor there. So the Lucifer is in, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, in Latin, it became Lucifer, and it is the light bringer. And the Old Testament was written primarily except for a couple of rare words and passages, in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language. So the word Lucifer could not have been put and written down in their language. It didn't exist. So then if the word were not part of their lexicon at that time, then who gave us the word Lucifer? What does it mean? Now, even though the words are different in different languages, there was a base meaning to it, and we'll get into that. But in 382 A.D., he was Pope, I always want to say Damasus, D-A-M-A-S-U-S. Pope Damasus I commissioned St. Jerome to write a revision of the old Latin translation of the Bible. And it was completed sometime during the 5th century A.D., so much later. And eventually it was considered the official and definitive Latin version of the Bible, according to the Roman Catholic Church. And by the 13th century, we're talking the 1200s, it was considered the Versio, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm squinting, the Versio Vulgate. So the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, the common translation. And it was St. Jerome who placed the word Lucifer into the Bible. And not just once, but 3 times. He puts it in Isaiah 14:12, Job 11:17, and 2 Peter 1:19. These were all put in, but in the Hebrew text, it didn't originally exist there. So, moving on in this, here are some of the verses in the King James Version. Now, I'm not a big King James guy. I should have looked these up in the NIV or the Message, a New Modern Translation, but this is the KJV, the King James Version, which, by the way, is not the only version of the Word of God, quote-unquote, as some people like to contend. The King James Version was just a version of the Bible that was compiled and translated in 1611 under King James I of England, Ireland, and Scotland. So those that version of the Bible is just written in almost like Shakespearean English. Think of it that way, because King James I lived right at the time of Shakespeare's writing. So this is the English that was being spoken. They felt this was the common language of the day. And so how many of us walk around in daily life today and say, "Oh, hither unto whereto in sooth are you going in the perambular part of the day?" Or "Wherefore unto I shall say to you, what your name is, else I know not, nor to how you do strike of mine." We don't talk that way. And so the King James Version, if you hear anybody say, "That's King James Version only, that's all, that's the authorized version of God's Word," that's a bunch of baloney, and it's bullshit. So it's just a 1611. It's an archaic translation of the Bible. It's not in modern English. So all that to say, I didn't put the modern translations down here. So sorry, and I'll translate it as I go a little bit into more modern English. So Isaiah 14:12 says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" So, that one's pretty easy. Art thou, we kind of know how to translate it into modern English. How are you fallen from heaven? We've seen you fallen from heaven. How are you fallen from heaven? Meaning, you have fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the morning. John 11:17 says, "And your age shall be clear, thine age shall be clearer than the noonday. Thou shalt shine forth, thou shalt be as the morning." This was John. That's Job, not John. This is talking about Lucifer, that what we've renamed Lucifer. You shall be as the morning, he says. So this whole idea of Lucifer being the light bearer was somebody he came out in the morning. He was the morning star. 2 Peter 1:19 says, "We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. And the same is said pretty much in the verses in the NIV version. So he's talking about the Christ, about Jesus, about how the day star will rise in your heart. Isaiah 14:12 again, you've fallen from heaven, O morning star, it says, son of the dawn. That's that same verse that in the King James says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? And in the Hebrew it says, how have you fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn? And those are the same passage. Job says, life will be brighter than noonday, and darkness will become like morning. In comparison. And then the 2 Peter passage, and we have the word of the prophets made more certain, and you will do well to pay attention to it, as to a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. By the way, you see the difference in the KJV to the NIV versions, the King James to the New International Version? Let me read that verse again from 2 Peter in the King James Version. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. Now again in the new, more modern translation, and we have the word of the prophets made more certain, and you'll do well to pay attention to it, as to a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Now, in the book of Revelation, it says, I, Jesus, I, Yeshua, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star. Let's see, I've got to scroll down in my notes here a little bit. The bright and morning star. Now, I want you to note something. The term morning star is used throughout the New Testament. It's in reference to Jesus the Christ, Yeshua. Keep this in mind. The Hebrew translation of the word Hallel in the place of Lucifer, or rather St. Jerome replaced the word Hallel with Lucifer. And what does Hallel mean? It means shining one. How art thou fallen from heaven, O shining one, son of the dawn, in the Hebrew. Until the day dawns and the shining one rises in your hearts, says Peter. And what then of the Greek translation? Hallel in Greek translates into Eusphorus, E-O-S-P-H-O-R-U-S, Eusphorus, or phosphorus in the Greek. Phosphorus. And it means light bearer. You know, sometimes we all get these little things that have glow-in-the-dark, like my son has glow-in-the-dark shirts with dinosaurs, and he always likes to get in front of the light and then come into my bedroom late at night and go, look, Dad, my shirt's shining, glows in the dark. And so that's what Hallel in the Greek means, in the Greek translation. Phosphorus, glows in the dark. So that is some of the places we find it in the Bible. Now, for those of you into numerology or gematria, I want you to see something very interesting. The names Lucifer and Jesus are exactly the same. It's 74 and 74, making 1. 222 and 222 makes 3. 444 and 444 makes 6. And the value of the morning star is the value of Lucifer and Jesus combined. 148, 444, 888. So now I don't understand numerology very well. I'm kind of passing that on to you for those of you who are into the numbers, and you know this. And I also, by the way, find it very interesting that the 444, the number 4 is the number of angels. So I was told in numerology, the number 4. And 444, I got a story to go with that, and I may have told this before. Rainey and I, about 14 years ago, we were sleeping in bed at night, and I have this big, heavy comforter. I still have it. It's one of those brown suede, soft, like kit glove suede comforters, and it's got the pile lining, the faux sheep lining on the underside, and it weighs a ton, and it's a California king size, so it weighs 1.5 tons. And we're sleeping in bed, and all of a sudden, I feel this, the whole cover gets pulled off of us, just in an instant. It wasn't like it slid off of us. It woke me up. Whoosh. The whole thing, and I sat up quick, and I caught it and pulled it back up on top of us. And as I turned over in bed, I kind of went, what was that? And I looked at the clock, and it was 4:44 in the morning. Now, with many other things, if you've heard some of my stories from that house that we lived in broadcasts past, this was just one of those things that happened in that house. And so something yanked this big comforter off of us. And even in the morning, by the way, I tried to establish how much of that blanket would had to have been off the bed already in order for gravity to just pull the rest of it off the corner of the bed. And so I conducted an hour's worth of experiments. And that blanket, we would have had to have been totally uncovered, and it was down at our feet before the weight of the rest of the blanket could have pulled it off the bed if it had slid off the bed at night or been kicked down there at night. So we had that whoosh, that thing pulled right off us. And 444 made a big play in there. So for those in numerology, if you can explain some of that in the chat room, I'm not into numerology, but I thought I'd better share that information with you. So it's interesting that those comparisons are made. Now, if I move on here a little bit, we've only got a couple, 3 minutes left in this segment before we have to cut out to break. The morning star, Jesus or Lucifer? Is Jesus the bright morning star, or is Lucifer? I've always thought of Lucifer as being the devil and Satan all through my time growing up, going through Bible college. I never had any of this explained to me in Bible college and seminary. He was the devil, Lucifer. But now there's a little confusion that's brought in, a little controversy brought in, because I see the term also used of the Christ. The Christ is the same descriptor. The bright morning star goes to the misnomer of Lucifer, which actually is an incorrect title for Satan or the devil, taken from the King James Version, as we just described by St. Jerome, who put the name in there in Isaiah 14:12. And were it not for this odd transliteration, Lucifer wouldn't exist as a term in the English, and there'd be no confusion on the matter whatsoever. As it is, we need to be very careful. I'd suggest using the term to describe who the Bible calls Satan or the devil, as most Christians do on this, yet still the term Lucifer persists. In any case, the morning star is the title of the Christ throughout the rest of Scripture. And then he's also given this title to this name, light bearer, that Jerome put in place. But he was also, Jerome was defining in Latin the term being used in Isaiah, the light bringer, the morning star. So who is this morning star? And since it's clear in Scripture that Jesus is called the bright morning star, how do we understand then the Isaiah 14:12 passage? So we'll get into that when we come back, because we got to go out to break right now. So 2 minutes, I'll be right back. Sit tight, don't go anywhere.
My heart rages around like an ocean in my head, because there are so many things that I left unsaid. I can My heart rages around like an ocean in my head. I can almost feel you walking in the distance, but I know that it's not reality. If you are echoing around inside these parallel dimensions all alone, know I'll find you in my dreams.
Hey folks, welcome back from the break. Glad to have you still here or freshly getting here. I want to thank you for listening to me, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Intrepid radio program on Odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com. And I always spell that out because we spell Odyssey differently. ODYSY1.com. Or you're watching the broadcast, simulcast, on my YouTube channel in video form with a live chat room. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And if you're over there in YouTube and you're not subscribed to my channel, subscribe. And go right down here below the screen and click like. Click the thumbs up. That just helps me in the long run on YouTube. So we ended with this idea talking about, since it's clear that Jesus is being referred to in the Bible as the bright morning star, how do we understand the Isaiah 14:12 passage where it talks about Lucifer, the light bringer, where it says, "How have you fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn?" Doesn't say Lucifer in the original text in the Hebrew language. It says, "O morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." But you're brought down to the grave, to the depths of the pit. Is this a sardonic title for the Antichrist or the beast, which we hear about in so much in eschatology and future prophecy of the end times? He claims to be Christ, right? In the New Testament verses, this Antichrist, he claims to be the Messiah and his moment under the sun, but he comes to be brought low ultimately. So that's one way to look at this verse, is that this is somebody who is being referred to as the Antichrist, the beast, the one. But I think that's too Tim LaHaye. That's too modern eschatology. Tim LaHaye, by the way, a writer, he wrote that whole series and they did movies on him. Don't even remember what they were. The Left Behind series. Big Christian writer in the 70s and the 80s. And he talked about biblical prophecy a lot. And Jesus lives out the gospel death first, the resurrection second. And the idea was that it is Satan, the deceiver, who wants it all now and will go down ultimately. Looks good at night, but goes down in the flames in the morning. Jesus is in the tomb, but arises in the morning. There's a pattern here. But I think this is trying to be applied to the Isaiah verse rather than an actual meaning behind the verse. There's another verse in 2 Thessalonians which says, "Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." And he goes on in Paul in Thessalonians, don't you remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? He's writing this epistle, this letter to the Thessalonians. And there's a few more verses on the morning star that I want you to see. And by the way, the Antichrist being placed into the context of the Isaiah 14 passage, I don't think that's strictly what it's talking about. I have heard that this is talking about a concept of nations falling and so on. I didn't dig into that quite as deeply because I want to make the name comparisons, but we're going to get to that eventually. If not today, we'll get to it. Because I can already tell, we're not going to get through this material just today. So, but I want to mention a few of the verses where, on the morning star, Numbers 24:17 says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, Jacob being another word for Israel. A scepter will rise out of Israel. This is in Numbers 24. Those are the words of Moses. Matthew 2:2 in the New Testament now. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. That was the Magi, the visitation of the Magi. Now, an interesting note on that is that we see all these nativity scenes and all this that show the baby Jesus in a manger and Mary and Joseph and all the shepherds and all the Magi with their camels because they've come out of the east to worship. But note what they say here. It says, where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and we've come to worship him. Now, they couldn't hop aboard a plane and get from the east, which we're kind of talking about. I don't know where in the east exactly they came from, because if you go north of Israel, it could be what is now Iraq, over to the northeast of Israel. It could be even farther east than that. It could be Oriental, as they used to call it. So if they saw the star in the east on the night that Jesus was supposed to have been born, they didn't hop on a plane. And they may not have gone even the next morning. There are many trains of thought that think that the Magi visited a couple of years later. They had to do all their astrological calculations and all of this and look this all up, and they started a journey, and they came with a caravan to find this King of the Jews. And at least the way the text writes it. And at least a couple of years would have passed. If you remember in the story of Jesus, it talks about how Herod, the king, the Roman puppet king of Israel, how Herod, jealous for somebody taking over his throne, paranoid by this point in his life, the Magi came to him first and asked him this question. And he says, I don't know what you're talking about. And he says, he says, when you find this baby boy, this King of the Jews, let me know. He says to the Magi, report back in. And then the Magi, they were told that, no, Herod's out to kill him. So they didn't go back to Herod. And they went back home another way, it says. Now Herod, he sent out the decree, according to the story, to kill all baby boys 2 years and under. And that's because of, I believe, the passage of time that had taken place. Now, of course, we have to look at that story and we have to ask, did it actually happen that way? We don't know for sure. That's for another topic, to dissect that story. But as the story is told us in the New Testament, that's what happened. And the Magi saw the star in the east, supposedly on the night of Jesus' birth. And they did all their studies and all their calculations and found this was supposed to usher in the King of the Jews and his birth. And so they came and they traveled over. And it was a good couple of years later. Now, and I think wasn't it at age 2 that Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt with the young Jesus to be protected from the edict of Herod, and that they were there for some time. That's another story too, the Egyptian home of Joseph and Mary. By the way, I was in a little church in Cairo back a few years ago, and in this little church, it's supposed to be the church that was built on the very spot that the house of Joseph and Mary stood, and that the church built out of that. Now, this is one of the oldest churches in Egypt. It's in Old Cairo, and this church has been there, I believe, for over 1,700 years, and you can go visit it. And you can go see it. They still hold services there. It's a church. I'm sure it's been reinforced and sections rebuilt and so on, but this church dates back to within 250 to 300 years of the time of Christ. And keep in mind, the mother of Constantine, I believe, was the one responsible for that. She was Helena, who would be considered the first biblical archaeologist, if you will. Constantine reigned over Rome in the early 300s. This was his mother. And she went out and she traveled to the Holy Lands and to identify all these sites that were associated with Jesus. And the church in Cairo is one of those. And so this is all the way back there. And that tradition being that close in time is, I think, pretty telling that this probably is where this took place. So, or at least traditionally, is said to have taken place. All right? Now, moving on. Matthew 2:7 says, Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report him to me, so that I too may go and worship him. And after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Now that says the star was still shining. And they followed that star to find Jesus. Luke 1 says, And you, my child, will be called a prophet. This is in speaking to the son of Zechariah, John, who became John the Baptist. A prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven and shine on those living in the darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. Again, the rising sun this time it talks about, the morning star. John 1 says, Come as a witness to testify, or he, John the Baptist, came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only to be a witness of the coming light, the true light that gives light to every man who is coming into the world. Isaiah 9 says, The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned, a prophecy of the Messiah. Matthew 4:6 says, The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Matthew is quoting Isaiah. Isaiah says, Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. And then John 8:12 says, And Jesus spoke again to the people and said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So Jesus compared himself in the text, the way it's written. It says he compared himself to the light of the world as mentioned in the prophecies of Isaiah, of the coming Messiah. So let's move on just a little bit more. I've got in here a note, the original association of the word Lucifer with Satan was a completely wrong assumption. And that only happened in rather modern times. The word simply means morning star. There's been no verse in the Bible that associates Satan with Lucifer as being one and same. The main one people think of is simply a poetic image of the morning star being outshined by the sun as it comes up. Lucifer never has been the name of any individual. On a side note that's unrelated but also interesting, the word Antichrist never appears in the book of Revelation. It only appears in the books of 1st and 2nd John. Yet in those verses, it only talks about the spirit of the Antichrist. And it says that there are many Antichrists, never an individual who is the Antichrist. Nor will ever be called an Antichrist. The whole idea of a singular person being called Antichrist is really a false notion. It's a misinterpretation. It's only a phrase which means against Christ. Antichrist, against Christ. Duh. It's not a person. And you can go look these verses up and find this stuff all to be so. Now, what's interesting about all of this, I've been going kind of all over the board here. I've just got to double check our time and see where we're at. Let's see. I just have to do the math in my head because, as you know, I'm pre-recording this, so I've got to make sure my minutes are right for my audio. And 35, then 20. Okay. I am at about 3 minutes left, if you can believe that. That's crazy. I thought I had a bunch more time than that. So I want to get into a couple of things right now. We're going to have to pick this up tomorrow night. But some of this refers to, remember, Lucifer. It means light bringer in the Latin. And the name doesn't appear in the actual text, but it does talk about the bright and morning star, the son of the morning. And so the light bringer, the bringer of light, the illuminator. I relate this back to things we've already talked about in the Garden of Eden, that how the serpent in the garden, Nakash, the definition of his name was the bringer of light, the illuminator, the bright shining one. Is this relating to the bright shining star in Isaiah 14:12, the fall of this bright shining star? We're going to get in that tomorrow and hit it, but I want to read you something first. Psalm 82, which I reference a lot, says, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. And there's a quote from God. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods. This is God talking again. You are all sons of the Most High. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall away like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth. The psalm ends, for all the nations are your inheritance. So I want you to put that in your kettle for a minute, because God there is speaking to the gods. And for God and gods, it uses the same word in the Hebrew, Elohim. And we're going to come back to that. We're going to talk about it more. And hopefully you're starting to get a picture, but hopefully I haven't just created a stew that's going to confuse you for now. Maybe it will. Hold on to your thoughts. We're going to hit this again tomorrow. Thanks for being here. I'll see you tomorrow night right here on the Intrepid radio program.